And with that said, I'm really pleased, excited, thrilled to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Candace Fujikane. Fujikane is professor of English at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa. Her critical and world-constructing scholarship is really hard, I think, to pin down into a neat slot. I personally think of her as a theorist of colonialism, sociality, and environment, an artist of sorts, an engaged activist, a geographer, and an ethnographer. Broadly speaking, her work thinks with and builds from practices and collectivities that both, quote, challenge the operations of the US occupying settler state and those that enact a future beyond it. With Jonathan Okamura, she co-edited the volume Asian Settler Colonialism, From Local Governance to the Habits of Everyday Life in Hawaii. And she is fresh off the publication of what I think of as a landmark book, and one that I had the pleasure of teaching a couple of months ago here at Tufts. I think many in our audience will be familiar with. The book is called Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future. And as a gift to you all, we will be raffling 3 copies today. So we will send out the email if you won the raffle later on this afternoon. Amongst her many formal and informal recognitions, she was recently awarded the Association for Asian American Studies Engaged Scholar Award in 2020. In short, today we are in for a rich and I think challenging treat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fujikane.
Thanks so much for that beautiful introduction, Alex. And thank you for inviting me to speak. And I also want to thank Sarah Gomez for working with me on the details of the talk. And thank you to Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke for making possible this environmental lecture series. So I'm just going to start with a PowerPoint. Everyone wants to see images of Hawaii, so it's really a great way of illustrating the problems and the possibilities that I'll be talking about today. So I will be talking about mapping abundance for planetary future, protecting the waters of Hawaii. So I am speaking to you from Kanaka Maoli lands in Heiʻeaʻuli on the island of Oahu, where Kanaka Maoli continue to stand for political independence from US occupation and settler colonialism. I speak as a 4th generation Japanese settler aloha aina, and this term settler aloha aina is one that Noelani Goodyear Kaupua uses for those of us who do not have Kanaka Maoli genealogy, but who stand for lands and waters in Hawaii and political independence. I have this kuleana, this responsibility, because the akua, what Kumuhula or hula master Pualani Kanaka Ole Kanahele translates as environmental forms, have physically raised me and become a part of my body. So this is Ohe'eaʻuli Ku'u'aina, or Heiʻeaʻuli is my beloved land. This is my mountain, Ku'upu'u, and this is Keahiakahoi. Kaniko'o is Ku'u'ua, or my beloved rain. And I have this great quote from Kikui, who teaches these amazing land stewardship classes in Hawaii. And you can find her classes at kikuhi.com. She says, you cannot restore an island landscape if you don't see yourself as a part of that place. And this is Ku'ukai o Kawaha o Kamano. So that means the mouth of the shark. And it actually has rings of reefs, just like the rings you would see in a shark's mouth. And that that reef system protects us from tsunamis that come at us from the northeast. So my book, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, Kanaka Maoli and Critical Settler Cartographies in Hawaii, begins with a central premise: capital fears abundance. So capital fears abundance. David Lloyd, in a brilliant essay, The Goal of the Revolution is the Elimination of Anxiety on the Right to Abundance in a Time of Artificial Scarcity, has argued that it is precisely the fear of abundance that is inscribed in neoliberal capital. Abundance is both the objective and the limit of capital. The crisis for capital is that abundance raises the possibility of a just redistribution of resources. Capital depends on growth through manufacturing of markets. Thus, capitalist modes of production manufacture the perception of scarcity to produce hunger. So to extend Lloyd's analysis, I argue that while capitalist economies proffer empty promises of imaginary plenitude, ancestral abundance feeds for generations. Economies of abundance create the conditions. I'm sorry, you can hear the rooster. It's early morning here in Kaneohe. So economies of abundance create the conditions for people to see beyond the competition for scarce resources to our own regenerative capacity to cultivate abundance. So mapping abundance then is a radical act in the face of settler capital's fear of an abundance that feeds. If cartographies of capital are drivers of the wastelanding of the earth, then I argue that mapping abundance strikes at capital where it is most vulnerable by making visible the abundance of indigenous economies by mapping that abundance. Every time we map abundance, we strike at capital. We undo its narrative of inevitability. Mapping abundance is an act of the radical refusal of capitalist economies. So today I'll be focusing on the stories of water protectors in Hawaii, from the awe-inspiring moʻo reptilian water deities who have stood as the guardians of water in Hawaii, to their descendants, Kanaka Maoli activists and scholars, as well as their settler allies who continue to stand for lands and waters in Hawaii today. I consider the hydrostratigraphy of lands as they are mapped vertically across different vau or horizontal realms of land stewardship, as identified by Kanahele and her Papaku Makawalu team of researchers who reclaim Ike Kupuna, or ancestral knowledge encoded in mele, song or chant, that explain how Kupuna, the elders or the ancestors, approached climate change events. I then trace the current material conditions where the US Navy stores 187 million gallons of jet fuel above 100 feet above the aquifer on Oahu. And the jet fuel from that facility is currently leaking into the drinking water of 93,000 military families and residents. I end by considering the lessons of stories of sharks swimming in the mountains and the story of a fish pond restoration project on the lands where the drinking waters have become contaminated. So how do we as academics and as activists work against late liberal settler capital for a planetary future? In my own work, I realized that as a settler aloha aina, as a scholar activist, I could use my research to present testimony to protect lands and waters in Hawaii. So we are here. I want to kind of say something quick about scalability. So the work we do in Hawaii has ripple effects across the globe. Just as a small 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature can cause glacier melt and sea level rise, a small restorative effect ripples across the earth. The work we do in Hawaii has material and epistemological impacts around the world, generating cascading regenerative effects. So to do this work, I read through thousands of pages of environmental impact statements, cultural impact assessments, archaeological inventory surveys, hydrological studies, and legislative bills. For the past 8 years, I have been slowly learning the beautiful intricacies and profound depth of Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language, to learn to think and write in Kanaka Maoli metaphors, to attend to the embodied theories that emerge organically from communities of practitioners. In 2010, I joined the struggles in Waiʻanae to protect the birthplace of the supernatural being Maui and the agricultural lands from the development of a light industrial park. And in 2012, I joined the struggles to protect the sacred mountain Mauna Awakea and its waters from the proposed construction of the 30-meter telescope. I've testified in toxic juridical settler state spaces to protect these lands and waters. And I've served as a legal observer, and I have stood on the front lines facing police officers armed with tear gas and sound cannon. So I think that's the embodied nature of the research that we're doing these days, you know. And it is the wonder of ancestral knowledges and aloha aina that sustains me in this work. I also join in the protocols of the lahui. I give my aloha to the akua and to the aina by offering the ho'okupu, or that's an offering of my breath in pule or prayer, my hands and my body on Saturday work days in lo'ikalo, which are the taro pond fields, or the lokoi'a, the fish ponds, and the kaniko'o rains of my home in Heiauli, whom I collect for the ahu, or the altars of other places. All of these practices honor and love the kupuna and the elements here, who are not mine genealogically, but are the ancestors of this place where I live. And this means sharing in the decolonial joy too, the wonder of these experiences that grows in us a desire to return to this work again and again. And it's hard sometimes because testifying in front of those, in those state agencies can be toxic, you know? And when necessary, I have been arrested. So my father taught me that it's necessary to challenge the law when it's unjust. And I want to make clear that I'm not fetishizing arrests, but when we see Native peoples from the smallest Pacific nations on the front lines of climate change, or in our own communities, and when those people are getting arrested multiple times, then those of us who can afford to get arrested can step in to help shoulder the burden of the arrests. And in those cases, we're standing there to hold space for those who cannot afford to be arrested. So I hold myself to a higher standard than to human laws. I hold myself accountable to the laws of the elements, which supersede the laws of humans. The critical settler cartography I engage in throughout the book is a methodology that's structured as a doubled praxis. Critical settler cartography first exposes the grandiose claims, contradictions, erasures, and ideological interests that drive settler colonial cartography or state cartography. As I practice it, that work begins with critiquing the toxic logics and imaginaries of late liberal settler colonial cartography. Exposing the interests of settler colonial cartography is the foundation of our work to dismantle settler capital regimes of rhetoric and their exploitative material practices. The second part of a critical settler cartographic method is to move the critique into the expansiveness of Kanaka Maoli cartographies that map familial relationality among humans, lands, and elemental forms, plant and animal ohana or family. Kanaka Maoli cartographies of i'ini or desire and le'a, pleasure, trace these lands with great tenderness and profound aloha aina, planting this love for land, seas, and skies in those not from these places so that we'll grow to care about their flourishing. So this leads to another important argument. Rather than seeing global climate change as apocalyptic, we can see those events as leading to the demise of settler capitalist economies of scarcity, making way for indigenous economies of abundance. So Kanaka Maoli are restoring the worlds where their attunement to climatic changes and their capacity for adaptation, transformation, and regeneration will enable them to survive what capital cannot. So yeah, the climate change is not about the end of humankind. It's about the end of perhaps capitalist humankind. Right now, we are seeing a resurgence of Kanaka Maoli ancestral knowledges, and more people are being taught how to engage more intimately with the elements and the climate change events that are happening around us. And we're learning to turn catastrophic events into possibilities for greater abundance. So this is a great example here. Much of my thinking about elemental cartographies grows out of work being done by the Edith Kanaka Maoli Foundation to teach us to grow our relationships with the elements. The Olelo Hawaii word akua has been popularly translated as God, but as Pua Kanaka Maoli Kanahele has taught us, again, akua means elemental forms. That's so key, because I grew up thinking of it as gods, but they're the elements. Kanaka Maoli mapped ancestral knowledges through naming 400,000 akua, including winds, rains, cloud formations, ocean currents, and waterways, each with their own elemental functions specific to hundreds of ahupua'a land divisions that generally extend from the mountains to the seas, each embodying the natural processes of growth, decay, and regeneration. So I love this example from Hui Mossman Kanahele, who's part of the Kanaka Maoli Foundation. So she talked about hina lua iko'a, hina who vomits or produces coral, as the process of coral spawning. And her partner is kukeapua, the rising motion of the coral gamete. So anytime you see the word ku, you think about that rising upward motion. And you have this beautiful way of talking about coral spawning as a relationship between this female energy and this male energy. So the word for that, connectedness is pilina. So we all kind of aspire to grow pili tuna aina, to grow that connectedness with land, seas, and skies. That rooster is really persistent. Can you all hear that rooster? He is definitely going to get a byline in this talk, yeah? Wow, okay. So the kanawaya keakua, the laws of the elements, have been discerned through the art of hilo, keen intergenerational observation and forecasting of elemental forms and their relationships with each other, tracking anomalies in order to, as my chant kumu, or teacher Aiai Bello explains, to assess, adapt, and activate. And we adapt and activate ourselves as well as the natural world, teaching us how we are to grow pilina, or intimately tied to aina. Kilo is the practice of reading the elements. And Papahuilani researcher Kalenu Uhiva explains, quote, when you kilo, when you observe closely, you are no longer afraid of the natural events that are happening in the world. You cultivate that relationship that our kupuna had with the natural world. Only when we have tracked the fine, end quote. Only when we have tracked the fine patterns of daily and seasonal changes for baseline recordings can we recognize the anomalies that are ho'ailona, or the signs. Kilo is not adaptation as resignation. It's an active analytic that enables us to anticipate change and to act to maximize their potentially abundant effects. So as Kanaka Maoli scientists have argued, we need to learn the names of the elements of our places if we are to survive, adapt to, and transform the effects of climate change. Hawaiian Studies and Environmental Sciences Professor Noelani Punivai explains, quote, and this is the one on the slide, if you know your akua, if you are pili to your akua, if you have aloha for your akua and understand their functions, you will know how to work with them and how to respond to them. We too must change. We have to adapt to the elements. The first adaptation is that we must know who the akua are. The akua are different on each island, in each ahupua'a, or land division. And we have to know the akua of our places. When we know our akua, we can call their names and activate them and ourselves, end quote. So I really love this way of becoming more attuned to, the elemental events that are happening around us every day. So this doesn't mean that we stop fighting at COP26 or, that we don't fight against corporate devastation of the earth. It means that in addition to that, we do this kind of work as well so that we understand what we're fighting for. So I have this really great example. Actually, this is from the document that they're drawing from. It's called, so Kanahele and her team of researchers put together a document called Kiho'iho'i Kanawai, and it's about island stewardship. And what they explain is that if we talk about understanding the elements and their relationships with each other, we understand that Kane, as the deity of fresh water that flows underground, and Kanaloa, who is the deep consciousness of the ocean, they have a very intimate relationship. They actually walk around the islands creating springs and drinking ava, which is a ceremonial drink. But when we think about the relationship between these elements, it is the cold underground springs that emerge out into the ocean, that mix with the warm salt waters, that fresh water flow from streams and springs cool a perimeter around the islands. So when the hurricanes come barreling over the warm waters of the Pacific, they veer north or they veer south of us. That's why I'm knocking on wood, we are fortunate to not have been hit as often as we might otherwise be. But that's why the relationship between Kane and Kanaloa is very important to our survival. So that's the kind of kilo observation that we need to be attentive to. Okay, so let's see. So I want to tell the story of how this protection of water at Red Hill can be grounded in the mo'olelo, or the storied history of Keaumelemele. So Keaumelemele is an oral tradition first recorded in the Hawaiian language newspapers in 1905. Keaumelemele is a girl who is also the golden cloud, and the story itself is about the hydrological cycle in Hawaii. One of the most visually stunning images in this oral tradition is that of the migration of the mo'o, the great reptilian water deities, from their home islands in the clouds to Hawaii. So in their lizard forms, the mo'o are formidable beings measuring 30 feet in length. In their Kanaka form, they are irresistibly beautiful women with great power, known to string yellow ilima flowers into lei while sunning themselves on rocks in pools of water. They are also desiring women known to seduce men and to kill their lovers. If mo'o are depicted as elemental forms to be feared, it is also because they are the awe-inspiring protectors of water. In the mo'olelo of Keaumelemele, Mo'oina Nea, the matriarch of mo'o deities, gathers her family of mo'o to accompany her from their cloud islands of Nu'umealani, Kealohilani, and Kuaihelani to Oahu. They arrive in the ehukai o Puaʻena, the misty sea spray of the surf at the jagged lava cape in Waialua, and they make their way to the dark waters of the long and narrow Ukoʻa fish pond, where the aka'akai, bulrushes, and the uki, sedge, stir with plentiful fish. Then across the wind-blown plains of Lauhulu, perhaps to the Kaukonahua stream, and from there to Kapukaki, today known as Red Hill. And I'm going to read the Olelo Hawaii version just so that it's important to be able to hear the rhythms of the language and to, for the land to hear us speak the mo'olelo as well. Ua hiki mua mai oia ma Puaʻena Waialua, aia ma laila kona wahi hoʻonoho pono ai I kāna huakaʻi nui, oia hoʻi ka huakaʻi o nā moʻo. Aia ma ke kula o Lauhulu ma Waialua, ua pani paʻaloa ia wahi e nā moʻo. O ka hiki mua ana ki ia o nā moʻo kupua ma ki ia pai aina, ma muli no ia o ka makemake o ka moʻo I nā nea. A pēnei e maupopo ai ka nui o nā moʻo. Ua hoʻonoho pālua ia ka hele ana o ka huakaʻi, o ka makamua o nā moʻo, aia ka piʻina o ka pukaki, a o ka hope no hoʻi aia no I Lauhulu. A mai mai o ke ia wahi mai, Waialua ewa, ua pani paʻaloa ia e nā moʻo. Moʻoni Inanea arrived first at Puaʻena in Waialua. There she arranged a great company of lizards. The plain of Lauhulu in Waialua was covered with them. This was the first time that the supernatural lizards arrived on these islands. It was through the will of Moʻoinanea. This is how we know the number of lizards. She set them 2 by 2 in the procession. When the first of the lizards reached the incline of Kapukaki or Red Hill, the last ones were still in Lauhulu, and between the two places, from Waialua to Ewa, the places were covered with lizards. So from these words, we can imagine the stately procession of mo'o, their great tails sweeping from side to side, flickering between their reptilian forms as enormous lizards and their human forms as fierce men and women making their way across the plains with the Ko'olau Mountains misted with rain to their left and the cloud-covered summit of Ka'ala in the Waianae Mountains to their right. So this is a geological map that explains what this mo'olelo teaches us. This mo'olelo is a mapping of water. The mo'olelo maps the hydrological cycle as it unfolds along the backbone of the continuous line of mo'o lizards. The mo'o arrive in the sea spray of Puaʻena, where salt particulates seed clouds that sweep along past the fish ponds, watering the plains of Waialua, where the waters of the two mountain ranges meet. So this is the Waianae volcanic series, and this is the Ko'olau volcanic series. This mapping of the migration of the mo'o may have taken place at a time when kupuna, the grandparents or ancestors, saw cascading changes in the natural world, perhaps an intensification of heat, a lessening of rainfall, shifts in the migration patterns of the anai or mullet, in the health of the limu or seaweed, in the number of o'opu, goby fish, who propel their way up waterfalls hundreds of feet high. One thing is certain: the arrival of the mo'o signals a historic moment when Kanaka Maoli began to pay greater attention to the care and conservation of water and the cultivation of fish. The mo'o became known as the guardians who enforced conservation kanawai laws to protect the springs, streams, and fish ponds, ensuring that water was never taken for granted. So this is Puaʻena here, and the sea spray seeding the clouds that travel along this seam. And this is called an erosional nonconformity, where the volcanic series meets and creates a dip, and that has created a pathway for the Kaukonahua stream. and it travels laterally across the land. We tend to think of water traveling, from the mountains to the seas, but this one travels laterally, and I take that as a lesson of the mo'olelo, that water travels across Ahupua'a in often unexpected ways. And this is Pearl Harbor down here. So the leaking of the jet fuel tanks would be in this area. Oops, or I think in this area right now. This is so tiny. Right about here. Yeah. Okay. And they made their way to Nu'uanu. And this is important because they also traveled underground. So I'll be getting into that kind of vertical cartography. Encoded in this mo'olelo is the art of keen intergeneral observation and forecasting, key to recording changes on the earth in story and song. And such changes were met with renewed efforts to conserve, protect, and enhance abundance. So this abundance is not for consumption only, but it's an abundance necessary for regeneration. We tend to think in a capitalist economy of abundance as solely meaning what we can consume rather than what we need to regenerate. The procession of mo'o teaches us cartographic principles of pilina, of the myriad ecosystems spread across the land, by all connected by vast arteries of surface and subterranean waterways. So if we follow the mo'o, they're huaka'i along the waterways. So this is Waialua, all the way across the sort of the isthmus of Oahu, and morning sounds of my household. Okay, and here is Diamond Head. You see how tiny it is there. So let's think about what's underground, because this is an island made through volcanic action. So you're going to have lava tubes and karst underground caves. And so beneath their kuaka'i may have at times taken them beneath the surface of the land to subterranean worlds, enclosing their own landscape of lakes, rivers, streams, and broad plains. Volcanic lava tunnel systems interbed with extensive limestone karst cave systems, joining waterways from the farthest points on the island, often below what seemed to be waterless plains. These caverns were so large in places that, as my teacher Aia Ibello explains, experts known as the ho'okele wa'a, or the navigators, navigated the caves, traveling through them by canoe. So if we go here, this is like a image from the Bishop Museum of the Karst Caves in Mo'iliili. So you can imagine that there were possible ways to traverse the land through these caves and caverns. And there's a lot of rumors about how the military uses these caves and tunnels to transport nuclear munitions and weapons. As the first pair of mo'o make their way along the Halawa stream, their great tails curve past the crater of Ahui Manu up the incline to Red Hill. Today it is at Kapuka Key that the mo'o engage in battle with monsters that lie beneath the surface of the land. The 20 underground jet fuel storage tanks filled with 187 million gallons of fuel lie buried like eggs of catastrophic potential. These storage tanks were built in 1941, and over the years, the steel liners have corroded to the thickness of 2 millimeters. In the event of an earthquake, there could be a flood of millions of gallons of jet fuel into the earth. And I wrote about this in my book in chapter 5. And, everyone knows it's just a matter of time. And at this time, they're finding jet fuel in the drinking water supply for the families, the military families who live near Pearl Harbor. And the threat is that the leak will continue to spread to other Board of Water Supply wells. And there's actually a map that illustrates. The Board of Water Supply stopped pumping water from the Halawa well here, up here, and the Aiea well, the Aiea well to prevent fuel contamination in the Navy system from migrating to the public water system. So you see how everything is so close. It's not even about, it's like all in the same area. And the US military, actually what I want to show you is the contamination sites. So I'll just kind of skip ahead to this image of where they're finding the jet fuel in their drinking water. So it's all over. It's all over. And you can see as far as Honouliuli, how far the waters have been contaminated. So the US military has long argued that the jet fuel storage facility presents no danger to the aquifer. And their arguments illustrate what I call a mathematics of subdivision. So it's a mathematics that uses it's a kind of iteration of enclosure. And in cases where settler capital cartographies dismember land into smaller and smaller pieces, isolating them from one another to the point where each fragment is, according to the occupying state, either no longer culturally feasible, culturally significant, or small enough to be given a token easement that can be built around. This diminishing of land is part of the larger project of the occupying state that must repeatedly, compulsively seize land through a piecemeal process, precisely because it never completely captures the occupied territory. There is always the possibility that the territory will escape its grasp. In the process, entire ecological systems become fractured, creating a devastating cycle of the fracturing of ecological systems that actually produces wastelands. So in 2017, the Navy argued that there is an impermeable layer. So this is the mathematics of division. There is an impermeable layer that contains the water above the aquifer. An impermeable layer between the groundwater in the Red Hill area that prevents water from reaching the Board of Water Supply drinking water wells. Using particle tracking to map out groundwater flow models in the area, the Navy argued that bedrock layers and valley deposits of saprolite protect the groundwater table. Here, as in elsewhere, the Navy was manufacturing a model of water based on the settler logic of enclosure and containment. What the Navy fails to disclose in their study is that in the representation of quote unquote perched water, there is always the possibility that those waters can overflow over the bounded area of the impermeable layer, or that the layer itself may have seeps and outlets from which any leakage from the fuel tanks will enter into the aquifer. So we've seen this at Mauna Kea, the same problems with the same arguments. So, you know, it really is important for us to pay attention to each other's struggles, because we're facing the same environmental impact statements that are actually written by these multinational corporations spread over 40 countries, and they're using the same logic all over the world. So in 2018, oh, you know what? I'm going to ask my husband to try to chase the rooster away. Okay, Glenn. Oh, too late. Too late. Just let my dog out. Let her have a good run. She never catches them. She just likes to chase them. Okay. Okay, so in 2018, the Sierra Club sued the Department of Health for failing to protect, the public health, and they won a major victory in their suit for failing to the Department of Health for failing to ensure that the Navy replace or upgrade the jet fuel tanks. Now, the Department of Health had long exempted the Red Hill tanks from rules governing spills and overfill protection, despite the fact that there have been numerous leakages, including a 27,000-gallon leak in 2014. Yet the resulting consent agreement among the Navy, the Department of Health, and the EPA gave the Navy 20 years to complete the upgrade. 20 years. It's like, this is crazy. The Sierra Club continued to fight for the removal of the jet fuel. On November 20th of 2021, just a couple months ago, The Department of Health found that there had been fuel leaked at the storage facility. Thousands of households had been exposed to dangerous levels of petroleum hydrocarbons. On December 6th, the state of Hawaii issued an emergency order instructing the Navy to drain its jet fuel tanks. The US Department of Justice just filed an appeal contesting the emergency order. So they want to keep the jet fuel in those tanks, despite the fact that military families have been taking the brunt of the contaminated waters. They've been becoming sick because of the contaminated waters. And actually, the military families are now suing. They're suing the I think the association who leases their lands to them. But there's a lawsuit. And the US Justice Department argued that the state overstepped its authority. This is a really scary thing, that national security comes at the expense of the people who are in the military. Of course, as people in Hawaii, we're kind of used to being dismissed, but it is like the military families that are being impacted the most here. So what has come out of this is a very powerful rising of the people and their stand for water. So this is, I don't want to end on, I never want to end on the negative. I always want to focus on the positive. And what has come out of this is the rising of people to protect the sacredness of Mauna Kea and its waters, which people are always connecting to Standing Rock and the Idle No More movement, and the ways that people are now standing at Red Hill. So this is June 24, 2015, all the 16 lines of kia'i, or protectors, standing on the road to to the summit of Mauna Kea, where construction crews were to begin building the 30-meter telescope. And you see how they kind of resemble the procession of mo'o across the land, because these lines went all the way up the mountain. And then this is the Wahine line. This particular line was very powerful, chanting Malana Mai Ka'u, which brings together the people in the building of a canoe, bringing the people together for the protection of water. And an artist, Haley Ka'ili'ehu, did this piece, Recolonize Your Na'au, to represent what the people look like. And this always reminded me of the image of the procession of the mo'o. Mo'o also means grandchildren, as well as the reptilian water protectors. It means a series, a line of interconnected elements. Yeah, these are the kupuna who chose to be on the front line at Mauna Kea. And this is the first day of the struggle in 2019. And 2 days later, 38 kupuna, or elders, and their kako'o, or assistants, were arrested by the state. And after the kupuna were arrested, the women quickly reformed the line and stood. There were 80 women protecting the Mauna, while the men sat behind them, so that the state officers wouldn't see us as a threat. We were there to protect, not to incite violence. And this is today the people who stand for Red Hill and the waters. They're actually standing for Kapukaki. And you see how there are so many young people involved in this movement, and they're all, getting that kind of education in standing for lands and waters. So I want to turn quickly to the ways that Kanaka Maoli would steward land differently. So they have, in this Kiho'iho'i Kanawai document, which you can find online, they have identified 22 vau, or horizontal realms of island stewardship, as well as the laws that protect each realm. There are 6 divisions for Vau Lani, the heavenly strata, 10 divisions of the Vau Honua, the island land base, and 6 divisions of the Vau Kanaloa, the ocean divisions. For these divisions, there are various kanawai that they have asserted regarding the care of these divisions of land. and their natural processes. The laws regarding the care of freshwater sources are broken down into multiple categories, and three of them I look at here are the Kanawai Pahulau, the Edict of 400 Chambers concerning the care of the aquifers, the Kanawai Pahukini, the Edict of 4,000 Chambers concerning the care of the aquifers, water tables, glaciers, caves, and watersheds, and the Kanawai Kane Milo Hae, an edict of passage, the ability for groundwater and underground water to have uninterrupted passage for the health of the island as fresh, cool waters deter hurricanes from decimating the islands. So that's the one, the Kane Milo Hai is the one that is the law that's being violated by the military's jet fuel facility. And it's just such a beautiful way in which Kanahele talks about Kane Milo Hai, who appears in the story of Hi'iaka. So I'm not going to go into depth here because I'm running out of time, but the important point I wanted to make is that Kane Milo Hai takes the form of a shark. And in Hawaii, we have so many stories of sharks who swim up into the mountains through these underground lava tubes. And there's a saying, there's a olelo no eau, alahula pu'uloa he alahele na ka'ahupahau. So everywhere in Pu'uloa is the trail of ka'ahupahau, reminding us that sharks had an embodied knowledge of such caverns, chambers, and tunnels, and it is ka'ahupahau who becomes familiar with every nook and cranny in this labyrinthine lava passageways as she makes her way through on the lookout for man-eating sharks who would harm the people. The sharks that swim into the mountains are the elemental deities, but osmoregulatory plasticity is an adaptability that enables sharks to move between saltwater and freshwater environments. And so this foregrounds the fact that the Navy's use of chemical tracers indexes the fallibility of that kind of study that is limited by time and money versus intergenerational observation and the intelligence of the sharks, who were the only ones who knew intimately the pathways of water. In these mo'olelo of sharks cruising into the mountains, we see the shark akua teaching Kanaka about entire worlds of water beneath their feet and the importance of stewarding these aquifers. Okay, and just a final image, which is, and this is a storyboard from an artist, Kupihea, showing the shark passage up to Kanaka Maoli, which means the cave of the shark. And so this is one example of a shark swimming into the mountains. This is the fish pond at Pu'uloa or Pearl Harbor. And this is where the practitioners are regenerating abundance, even though the EPA has classified Pearl Harbor as a Superfund site. And when I was speaking with one of the kupuna there, she said, we don't call this place a Superfund site. It is a living and breathing place. It is a place where native plants and animals are returning because we are taking care of this place. So it's, again, a reminder that that a small regenerative act ripples and cascades into in ways that we often don't realize or know. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And we have time for a few questions. So we have one question in the Q&A. I had a question sent in before that I'm going to read first. And if anyone else has a question, they can raise their hand or put it in the Q&A. Ben Chisholm, a first-year undergraduate student that read your book and was really enamored by it, couldn't make it today because of a class conflict, but sent in a question that he was hoping I'd ask. And I think it's more it's in the context of practicing kilo, growing Pilina is slow. Maybe that's not the word you use, but it takes time. It takes effort to build these connections. It's intergenerational. And so Ben's question is, what do you think about the global deadlines for climate change that we are constantly confronting, that we are
Yeah.
constantly being told we have 12 years, 10 years, and so forth. The sort of speed of demand and action that is being asked of everyone. How do you think about that?
That's such a great question. That's a really excellent question. So I had this kind of anxiety about climate change before I started interviewing the practitioners, but every single practitioner was very deliberate and very steady in their focus and in their purpose. And Puni Jackson, who's the program coordinator at Ho'olu'aina, which is a restoration project in Kalihi Valley, she explained, for us as Indigenous people, we have always had to adapt to change. From colonization and enslavement and genocide, we have always had to adapt to change. So it's not as if we have to turn this big ship around. We will continue to do what we have always done. And in that will be our survival. So for example, yes, there's a way in which we will continue to stand against corporate devastation of the earth, but we will also recognize that sometimes what we see as devastating climate change effects is sometimes where water used to be. So if you watch the movie, like I like to teach films like Weathering with You. At the end of the film, when it has been raining constantly and I know it's like so much of Tokyo is underwater, an older woman observes, well, this is what it used to be like, in the, a long time ago. It used to be all underwater. The earth has gone through so many changes. The earth will survive. It's just whether we will, right? And how we prepare ourselves. So what Puni says is we are not going to make like short, hasty decisions like putting jet fuel over an aquifer. We are going to think intergenerationally. If something good happens, like we see coral coming back in Kawahaukamano in Kaneohe Bay, then we have to actually assess whether that coral, whether the things that are making the changes are invasive, because that could also have other kinds of negative effects. So they're very cautious in a way that I think is because they think long-term. They're not thinking, how will we survive the next 12 years? They're thinking about how will we survive beyond that? So, it's a mindset. It's an abundant mindedness that I think gives us a more steady sense of purpose. So I didn't panic after that. It didn't make me any less motivated to change the world, but it kind of made me appreciate that my ability to work in a fish pond will have restorative effects. My ability to work, that these things that I do make a difference. And I think that's just how, as students, often you feel powerless in this world, but that's what has to keep us going, is living our lives in the best way possible without thinking. There's an urgency there, and we're all, doing as much as we can, but we have to think that we're in it for the long haul and we don't want to burn ourselves out. How do we pace ourselves? How do we pass this on to our children? And again, it's heartbreaking to me when my son, who was 10 at the time, told me that he doesn't think he'll have children because he says we won't be alive. And I tell him, don't think like that. Don't think like that. You never know what's going to happen with this pandemic and everything shutting down. A lot of the places like here, there's Hanauma Bay is a tourist hotspot. And when tourists stopped flying, the reef system regenerated itself. It was amazing to see, like within a span of 6 months, how much regeneration happened. So things can regenerate fairly quickly, and given the right conditions, it will. So anyway, that's how I see things, and that might be related to Jennifer Riley's question, right?
I think it is related to Jennifer. It's actually my own question, and I'm going to
Yeah,
take Jennifer's question and maybe,
yeah,
well, you can push back, but almost turn you into a self-help guru for a second.
okay,
Obviously, to me, when speaking about your book in the class, what we just notice is it's just you're practicing abundance in the writing at every moment. Activism in Hawaii ripples out. Climate change will signal the end of capitalism, not the end of humanity or the end of the world. But this is a must all, certainly, as I think you note, is built from everyday and mundane practices. And so I guess I'd just be interested to hear if you're willing to share how you have practiced abundance, how you kind of cultivate that possibility laden positive affect that underlies your work.
yeah. How do you stay hopeful when you face immense resistance from your own government, right? Okay, so you look for the positives. So when I first started standing with people at Mauna Kea, it is devastating to keep going to these meetings, and you can have 1,000 people give testimony as to why something should not happen, and the commission will do it anyway, or the state agency will do it anyway. And what I saw was that one of the leaders at Mauna Kea, her name is Pua Case, posted a Facebook post that said, it was a picture of her with her 2 daughters, and she says, it's for them that we still have to focus on enjoying our lives and laughing together. We don't want to pass on to them the despair, or we don't want to pass on to them the, any kind of sense of futility, because you want to make them engaged in this movement. We're not standing against something. So we're not standing against climate change, or, we're not standing against the elements. We're working with them. We're standing against corporations, but she says, who I stand with and who I stand for is more important than who I stand against. So she said that in a quote. And I thought that was so moving, that you want to pass on to your children a way of standing. I don't want to, I come home from meetings and it was so full of despair. I would lie down, my son was maybe like 3 years old, and I would lie down next to him and I would just listen to his breathing. And I think to myself, there's so much more at stake than this one decision, right? This is the long term. I'm in this for the long haul. And your child's breathing makes you remember that you're fighting for them and for their lives, and you don't want to make them remember, like, I'm sorry, I'm so into pop culture, but the Terminator, how the mother really brings down the son. He's like, chillax, mom. You don't want to be that parent. And especially since I'm so involved in a lot of things, I try to bring my sons in. I mean, sometimes I have to bribe them, but at least they're doing the work, and it's something that they'll carry with them as they get older. So yeah, I think the positivity of it is in when you work. Okay, so go to a work day at a place, have an auntie tell you, this is not a super fun site. This is a living and breathing place that we are helping to restore. Or she doesn't even use the word restore. They use the word that they're malama, or they're caring for these places. They're cultivating and caring for these places. And when there's that much love, I guess the movement, and everyone focuses on love. Even Naomi Klein says, right, that love is going to be the reason that we save the earth. And she's often asked how she can still be positive about things. And she says, because that's how I choose to live. It's a choice, right? It's a choice for us. We can choose, in the sense that you can choose to look on what is the positive outcomes of all of these catastrophic things that we see happening, like in our government. What we see is the rising of the people. You see people growing relationships with each other because they see the injustice happening. Yeah. And the key in all of this is not to think of the elements as adversarial. I think too often people say that Mother Nature is striking back. I mean, of course, our actions, corporate actions, have consequences, but to not have that adversarial relationship. When Kanaka talk about sea level rise, they say Kanaloa is rising. So the deep consciousness of the ocean is rising. That deep consciousness also signifies ancestral knowledge. So we see the resurgence of ancestral knowledge. But I guess the bottom line is you have to go to a work day, at a farm, at a fish pond, to see how the people who do it day in and day out, how they teach others to continue that fight. Yeah. Otherwise we just get depressed. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We are at the end of time, but that's a great note to end with. There was a couple of questions. If you can stay for a few extra minutes, I'm going to turn off the webinar, but thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And,
okay. Yeah, if you want to keep the webinar recording, that's fine with me. Oh, yeah. Okay. It's either way. It's
good.
Okay.
We have from Sophia a question you might see in the chat.
Yeah, I do see it. So there's been a lot of pushback against visiting Hawaii and being tourists in Hawaii. If we are to travel to Hawaii, or say our parents are planning a trip, how can we keep these lessons in mind and help support rather than harm Native communities there? Yeah, it's a really tricky question, because Haunani K-Trask used to say, don't come. But if you do come, there are so many ways to support the people here. It's kind of nice if you look up restoration projects. It's actually, to me, the best way to see Hawaii is to volunteer at a restoration project. I think, like, if you went to Ho'olu'aina in Kalihi Valley, wow, that would be amazing, because I remember one day in Kalihi Valley, I actually saw how they make bark cloth, which is a process that takes like about 2 months. Not including growing the vauke, but I saw them grow from planting the seedlings to actually pounding the kapa, and that all in one day. That's better than any show in Waikiki, So yeah, I would encourage people to go to join a work day. We used to do these tours in Waianae for decision makers, and sometimes we would invite other visitors as multipliers. So multipliers are people who take what they learn and share it with their communities in other places. So you see like bus tours of the West Bank, or you see black taxi tours in Belfast. I've been on both, actually. Oh no, I haven't gone to the West Bank, but I've been on the black taxi tour in Belfast, and that's the way you kind of learn more and to donate, and you can make a donate instead of buying stuff from the tourist shops. You can, sometimes they have t-shirts for sale, or you can donate to their projects. And I think it's really cool when you can kind of see that your money is helping to regrow a place.
Gary had a hand up. Gary, if you're still with us.
I am. I was typing my question, but I'll better to speak it.
Yeah.
First of all, mahalo for a very stimulating presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I grew up in Hawaii and became radicalized with the Waihole Waikane struggle.
Oh, wow. That's very cool.
I fully appreciate where you're coming from in terms of independence and so on.
Yeah.
I wonder, as an historian, I wonder about your narrative about the mo'o as symbolically human beings and a real migration. I think the mo'o are revered throughout Polynesia, certainly in Tahiti. So there's nothing specific to Hawaii about the mo'o. And the mo'olelo themselves are, they're chants. They're not, so they are kind of hard to work with. But I'm just wondering if you're playing more stress on that as a historical episode than as a kind of analogy or allegory, perhaps. And the other thing I wanted to ask about is the akua. And you're saying they're not gods, they're elements, but because of all the diverse types that there are, but couldn't one say that of the kami of Japan? I mean, one could construct an ecological worldview based upon ancient Japanese religion, but what's the point?
So the difference with Japan would be that there are 400,000 akua, each specific. And I would say that, so the mo'o are specific to Hawaii in that the mo'o went and traveled to every body of water. So every body of water in Hawaii has a different mo'o, and each body of water has a different set of laws in terms of whether it's a fish pond or whether it's a stream or whether it's a spring. So I would say that it's not a blanket kind of thing that mo'o represent X. It's that they're specific to their places. And so, so when I think of the migration of the mo'o, I definitely think that that story is about a climate change event, yeah. And at the same time, it was a way to remind people that waters are to be protected by these beings, yeah. So they are the mo'o. So the migration of the mo'o, it happens every day. It's a daily occurrence. It's a daily occurrence in terms of the hydrological cycle. So you could say that the mo'o are always, every day, walking across the island, you know. And I had a student who was really cool. She said, "You mean so like if I see a line of clouds stretching from Waialua across the mountains, is that?" I'm like, "Yep, that could be like, you know, the procession of the mo'o." So I think these mo'olelo or storied histories ask us to stretch our imaginations in so many different ways. So it's not just something that happened in the past, but just like as in the romance between Pele and Kamapua'a, that happens on a daily basis too, right? So the lava burns the vegetation, and the Kamapua'a revegetates the lava, and it's a natural process. So they're not just elements, they're also natural processes. So laka is also the natural process of evapotranspiration, according to the Kanaka Maoli school of, you know, Papaku Makawalu. Yeah, so it's really, I think that that's a way of thinking more broadly about why do they take human forms, you know? It is so that we can call their names and have relationships with them in on a different kind of level, you know, like when you hear, okay, so if how do women have passionate affairs with elemental beings? Brandy Nalani McDougall has a beautiful book of poetry called The Salt Wind, Kamakani Pa'akai, and there's a beautiful poem about her grandmother running into the rain and her mother calling at her to come back in, and she's like, "But Lani, the rain would caress," and she goes into this very like erotic description of what the rain is doing to her. And that is a relationship with the elements that's based on a kind of human conception of passionate love, right? At the same time, there are other kinds of aloha aina, like when people thought of Kaho'olawe, the island that was being bombed by the military, as a child. And it really, I think a lot of parents, the men who occupied Kaho'olawe to stop the bombing, would describe the island as a child, and that that child needed to be cared for as much as their own children. So any way that these stories can create that bond between humans and elements is, and you know, for humans, we often have to think in terms of human to human relationships. I think that's why these figures, like if you look at Hi'iaka Kapoli o Pele, you know, Pele takes the form of a woman, you know, but that's so that we can function on a human level. But if we broaden, the Kanaka Maoli school is asking us to broaden out our imagination to think about the movement of magma and the relationships between the formation of the lava. And so like Pele's relationship with her sister Namaka'okahai is she's the ocean, and how there's often this battle between the lava and the ocean in creating new land. It's a long way of thinking about it, but I think basically it's to open up our imaginations to be able to appreciate the specificity of the particular stories happening in particular places. So the mo'o stories about mo'oina nea on the mo'o on Mauna Kea are quite different from the mo'o stories of I can't remember her name now. Kua'aina? Kai Kua'ana? Something like that. Who is the mo'o of Pu'uloa, Pearl Harbor. They have different functions. So I think that's the thing. Functionality is different for these different akua.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just my phone's going.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Candace. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. So